Chapter 10, Part 1 of Through the Brazilian Wilderness. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Kalinda. Through the Brazilian Wilderness by Theodore Roosevelt. Chapter 10. To the Amazon and Home. Zoological and Geographical Results of the Expedition. Part 1. Our adventures and our troubles were alike over. We now experienced the incalculable contrast between descending a known and travelled river and one that is utterly unknown. After 4 days we hired a rubberman to go with us as guide. We knew exactly what channels were passable when we came to the rapids, when the canoes had to unload, and where the carry trails were. It was all child's play compared to what we had gone through. We had made long days' journeys, for at night we stopped at some palm-thatched house, inhabited or abandoned, and therefore the men were spared the labor of making camp. And we bought ample food for them, so there was no further need of fishing and chopping down palms for the palm-tops. The heat of the sun was blazing, but it looked as if we had come back into the rainy season, for there were many heavy rains, usually in the afternoon, but sometimes in the morning or at night. The mosquitoes were sometimes rather troublesome at night. In the daytime the piums swarmed, and often bothered us even when we were in mid-stream. For 4 days there were no rapids we could not run without unloading. Then on the 19th we got a canoe from Senor Barbosa. He was a most kind and hospitable man, who also gave us a duck and a chicken and some mandioc and 6 pounds of rice, and would take no payment. He lived in a roomy house with his dusky, cigar-smoking wife and his many children. The new canoe was light and roomy, and we were able to rig up a low shelter under which I could lie. I was still sick. At noon we passed the mouth of a big river, the Rio Branco, coming in from the left. This was about in latitude 9 degrees 38 minutes. Soon afterward we came to the first serious rapids, the Panela. We carried the boats past, ran down the empty canoes, and camped at the foot in a roomy house. The doctor bought a handsome trumpeter bird, very friendly and confiding, which was thenceforth my canoe companion. We had already passed many inhabited and still larger number of uninhabited houses. The dwellers were rubbermen, but generally they were permanent settlers also, homemakers with their wives and children. Some, both of the men and women, were apparently of pure negro blood, or of pure Indian or South European blood, but in the great majority all 3 strains were mixed in varying degrees. They were most friendly, courteous, and hospitable. Often they refused payment for what they could afford out of their little to give us. When they did charge, the prices were very high, as was but just, for they lived back of the beyond, and everything cost them fabulously, save what they raised themselves. The cool, bare houses of poles and palm thatch contained little except hammocks and a few simple cooking utensils, and often a clock, or sewing machine, or Winchester rifle from our own country. They often had flowers planted, including fragrant roses. Their only livestock, except the dogs, were a few chickens and ducks. They planted patches of mandioc, maize, sugar-cane, rice, beans, squashes, pineapples, bananas, lemons, oranges, melons, peppers, and various purely native fruits and vegetables, such as the canyabo, a vegetable fruit growing on the branches of a high bush, which is cooked with meat. They get some game from the forest, and more fish from the river. There is no representative of the government among them. Indeed, even now their very existence is barely known to the governmental authorities, and the Church has ignored them as completely as the State. When they wish to get married, they have to spend several months getting down to and back from Manaos or some smaller city, and usually the first christening and the marriage ceremony are held at the same time. They have merely squatters' rights to the land, and are always in danger of being ousted by unscrupulous big men who come in late but with the title technically straight. The land laws should be shaped so as to give each of these pioneer settlers the land he actually takes up and cultivates, and upon which he makes his home. The small home-maker who owns the land which he tills with his own hands is the greatest element of strength in any country. These are real pioneer settlers. They are the true wilderness winners. No continent is ever really conquered, or thoroughly explored, by a few leaders or exceptional men, although such men can render great service. The real conquest, the thorough exploration and settlement, is made by a nameless multitude of small men, of whom the most important are, of course, the home-makers. Each treads most of the time in the footsteps of his predecessors, but for some few miles, at some time or other, he breaks new ground, and his house is built where no house has ever stood before. Such a man, the real pioneer, must have no strong desire for social life, and no need, probably no knowledge, of any luxury, or of any comfort, save of the most elementary kind. The pioneer who is always longing for the comfort and luxury of civilization, and especially of great cities, is no real pioneer at all. These settlers whom we met were contented to live in the wilderness. They had found the climate healthy and the soil fruitful. A visit to a city was a very rare event, nor was there any overwhelming desire for it. In short, these men, and those like them everywhere on the frontier between civilization and savagery in Brazil, are now playing the part played by our backwoodsmen, when over a century and a quarter ago they began the conquest of the great basin of the Mississippi, the part played by the Boer farmers for over a century in South Africa, and by the Canadians, when less than half a century ago they began to take possession of their Northwest. Every now and then some one says that the last frontier is now to be found in Canada or Africa, and that it has almost vanished. On a far larger scale this frontier is to be found in Brazil, a country as big as Europe or the United States, and decades will pass before it vanishes. The first settlers came to Brazil a century before the first settlers came to the United States and Canada. For 300 years progress was very slow. Portuguese colonial government at that time was almost as bad as Spanish. For the last half-century and over, there has been a steady increase in the rapidity of the rate of development, and this increase bids fair to be constantly more rapid in the future. The Paulistas, hunting for lands, slaves, and mines, were the first native Brazilians who, a few hundred years ago, played a great part in opening to a settlement vast stretches of wilderness. The rubber hunters have played a similar part during the last few decades. Rubber dazzled them, as gold and diamonds have dazzled other men and driven them forth to wander through the wide waste spaces of the world. Searching for rubber, they made highways of rivers the very existence of which was unknown to the governmental authorities or to any map-makers. Whether they succeeded or failed, they everywhere left behind them settlers, who toiled, married, and brought up children. Settlement began. The conquest of the wilderness entered on its first stage. On the 20th we stopped at the first store, where we bought, of course at a high price, sugar and tobacco for the camaradas. In this land of plenty the camaradas overate, and sickness was as rife among them as ever. In Cherrie's boat he himself and the steersman were the only men who paddled strongly and continuously. The storekeeper's stock of goods was very low, only what he still had left from that brought in nearly a year before, for the big boats, or batalões, had not yet worked as far upstream. We expected to meet them somewhere below the next rapids, the Inferno. The trader or rubberman brings up his year's supply of goods in a batalão, starting in February and reaching the upper course of the river early in May, when the rainy season is over. The parties of rubber explorers are then equipped and provisioned, and the settlers purchase certain necessities, and certain things that strike them as luxuries. This year the Brazil nut crop on the river had failed, a serious thing for all explorers and wilderness wanderers. On the 20th we made the longest run we had made, 52 kilometers. Lyra took observations where we camped. We were in latitude 8 degrees 49 minutes. At this camping place the great, beautiful river was a little over 300 meters wide. We were in an empty house. The marks showed that in the high water a couple of months back, the river had risen until the low part of the house was flooded. The difference between the level of the river during the floods and in the dry season is extraordinary. On the 21st we made another good run, getting down to the Inferno Rapids, which are in latitude 8 degrees 19 minutes south. Until we reached the Cardozo, we had run almost due north. Since then we had been running a little west of north. Before we reached these rapids we stopped at a large, pleasant thatched house and got a fairly big and roomy as well as light boat, leaving both our two smaller dugouts behind. Above the rapids a small river, the Maderaña, entered from the left. The rapids had a fall of over 10 meters, and the water was very wild and rough. Met with for the first time, it would doubtless have taken several days to explore a passage, and with danger and labor get the boats down. But we were no longer exploring, pioneering, over unknown country. It is easy to go where other men have prepared the way. We had a guide. We took our baggage down by a carry 3/4 of a kilometer long, and the canoes were run through known channels the following morning. At the foot of the rapids was a big house and store, and camped at the head were a number of rubber workers, waiting for the big boats of the head rubbermen to work their way up from below. They were a reckless set of brown daredevils. These men lead hard lives of labor and peril. They continually face death themselves, and they think little of it in connection with others. It is small wonder that they sometimes have difficulties with the tribes of utterly wild Indians with whom they are brought in contact, although there is a strong Indian strain in their own blood. The following morning, after the empty canoes had been run down, we started, and made a rather short afternoon's journey. We had to take the baggage by one rapids. We camped in an empty house in the rain. Next day we ran nearly 50 kilometers, the river making a long sweep to the west. We met half a dozen batellows making their way upstream, each with a crew of 6 or 8 men, and 2 of them with women and children in addition. The crew were using very long poles with crooks, or rather the stubs of cut branches which served as crooks, at the upper end. With these they hooked into the branches and dragged themselves up along the bank, in addition to poling where the depth permitted. The river was as big as the Paraguay at Corumba, but in striking contrast to the Paraguay, there were few water birds. We ran some rather stiff rapids, the Inferno, without unloading, in the morning. In the evening we landed for the night at a large, open, shed-like house, where there were 2 or 3 pigs, the first livestock we had seen other than poultry and ducks. It was a dirty place, but we got some eggs. The following day, the 24th, we ran down some 50 kilometers to the Carupanan Rapids, which by observation Lyra found to be in latitude 7 degrees 47 minutes. We met several batellows, and the houses on the bank showed that the settlers were somewhat better off than was the case farther up. At the rapids was a big store, the property of Senor Caripe, the wealthiest rubberman who works on this river. Many of the men we met were in his employ. He has himself risen from the ranks. He was most kind and hospitable, and gave us another boat to replace the last of our shovel-nosed dugouts. The large open house was cool, clean, and comfortable. With these began a series of half a dozen sets of rapids, all coming within the next dozen kilometers, and all offering very real obstacles. At one we saw the graves of 4 men who had perished therein, and many more had died whose bodies were never recovered. The toll of human life had been heavy. Had we been still on an unknown river pioneering our own way, it would doubtless have taken us at least a fortnight of labor and peril to pass. But it actually took only a day and a half. All the channels were known, all the trails cut. Senor Caripe, a first-class waterman, cool, fearless, and brawny as a bull, came with us as a guide. Half a dozen times the loads were taken out and carried down. At one cataract the canoes were themselves dragged overland, elsewhere they were run down empty, shipping a good deal of water. At the foot of the cataract, where we dragged the canoes overland, we camped for the night. Here Kermit shot a big cayman. Our camp was alongside the graves of 3 men who at this point had perished in the swift water. Senor Caripe told us many strange adventures of rubber workers he had met or employed. One of his men, working at the Gy Parana, got lost, and after 28 days found himself on the Maderaña, which he thus discovered. He was in excellent health, for he had means to start a fire, and he found abundance of Brazil nuts and big land tortoises. Senor Caripe said that the rubbermen now did not go above the 9th degree, or thereabouts, on the upper Aripuanan proper, having found the rubber poor on the reaches above. A year previously 5 rubbermen, Mundurucu Indians, were working on the Corumba at about that level. It is a difficult stream to ascend or descend. They made excursions into the forest for days at a time after caoutchouc. On one such trip, after 15 days, they, to their surprise, came out on the Aripuanan. They returned and told their patron of their discovery, and by his orders took their caoutchouc overland to the Aripuanan, built a canoe, and ran down with their caoutchouc to Manaos. They had now returned, and were working on the upper Aripuanan. The Mundurucus and Brazilians are always on the best terms, and the former are even more inveterate enemies of the wild Indians than are the latter. By mid-forenoon on April 26th we had passed the last dangerous rapids. The paddles were plied with hearty good-will, Cherrie and Kermit, as usual, working like the camaradas, and the canoes went dancing down the broad, rapid river. The Equatorial Forest crowded on either hand to the water's edge, and although the river was falling, it was still so high that in many places little islands were completely submerged, and the current raced among the trunks of the green trees. At 1 o'clock we came to the mouth of the Castano proper, and in sight of the tent of Lieutenant Pyrineus, with the flags of the United States and Brazil flying before it, and with rifles firing from the canoes and the shore, we moored at the landing of the neat, soldierly, well-kept camp. The upper Aripuanan, a river of substantially the same volume as the Castano, but broader at this point, and probably of less length, here joined the Castano from the east, and the two together formed what the rubbermen called the lower Aripuanan. The mouth of this was indicated, and sometimes named on the maps, but only as a small and unimportant stream. We had been 2 months in the canoes, from the 27th of February to the 26th of April. We had gone over 750 kilometers. The river from its source, near the 13th degree, to where it became navigable and we entered it, had a course of some 200 kilometers, probably more, perhaps 300 kilometers. Therefore, we had now put on the map a river nearly 1,000 kilometers in length, of which the existence was not merely unknown, but impossible if the standard maps were correct. But this was not all. It seemed that this river of 1,000 kilometers in length was really the true upper course of the Aripuanan proper, in which case the total length was nearly 1,500 kilometers. Pyrineus had been waiting for us over a month, at the junction of what the rubbermen called the Castano and of what they called the upper Aripuanan. He had no idea as to which stream we would appear on, or whether we would appear upon either. On March 26th he had measured the volume of the two, and found that the Castano, although the narrower, was the deeper and swifter, and that in volume it surpassed the other by 84 cubic meters a second. Since then the Castano had fallen. Our measurements showed it to be slightly smaller than the other. The volume of the river after the junction was about 4,500 cubic meters a second. This was in 7 degrees 34 minutes. We were glad indeed to see Pyrineus and be at his attractive camp. We were only 4 hours above the little river hamlet of Sauiau, a port of call for rubber steamers, from which the larger ones go to Manaos in 2 days. These steamers mostly belonged to Senor Caripe. From Pyrineus we learned that Laureado and Fiala had reached Manaos on March 26th. On the swift water in the gorge of the Papagayo, Fiala's boat had been upset and all his belongings lost, while he himself had narrowly escaped with his life. I was glad indeed that the fine and gallant fellow had escaped. The Canadian canoe had done very well. We were no less rejoiced to learn that Amilcar, the head of the party that went down the Gy Parana, was also all right, although his canoe too had been upset in the rapids, and his instruments and all his notes lost. He had reached Manaos on April 10th. Fiala had gone home. Miller was collecting near Manaos. He had been doing capital work. The piranhas were bad here, and no one could bathe. Cherrie, while standing in the water close to the shore, was attacked and bitten, but with one bound he was on the bank before any damage could be done. We spent a last night under canvas at Pyrineus's encampment. It rained heavily. Next morning we all gathered at the monument which Colonel Rondon had erected, and he read the orders of the day. These recited just what had been accomplished, set forth the fact that we had now, by actual exploration and investigation, discovered that the river whose upper portion had been called the Duvida on the maps of the Telegraphic Commission, and the unknown major part of which we had just traversed, and the river known to a few rubbermen, but no one else, as the Castano, and the lower part of the river known to the rubbermen as the Aripuanan, which did not appear on the maps, save as its mouth was sometimes indicated, with no hint of its size, were all parts of one and the same river, and that by order of the Brazilian government this river, the largest affluent of the Madeira, with its source near the 13th degree and its mouth a little south of the 5th degree, hitherto utterly unknown to cartographers and in large part utterly unknown to any one save the local tribes of Indians, had been named the Rio Roosevelt. We left Rondon, Lyra, and Pyrineus to take observations, and the rest of us embarked for the last time on the canoes, and borne swiftly on the rapid current, we passed over one set of not very important rapids, and ran down to Senor Caripe's little hamlet of Sauiau, which we reached about 1 o'clock on April 27th, just before a heavy afternoon rain set in. We had run nearly 800 kilometres during the 60 days we had spent in the canoes. Here we found and boarded Pyrineus's river steamer, which seemed in our eyes extremely comfortable. In the señor's pleasant house we were greeted by the señora, and they were both more than thoughtful and generous in hospitality. Ahead of us lay merely 36 hours by steamer to Manaos. Such a trip as that we had taken tries men as if by fire. Cherrie had more than stood every test, and in him Kermit and I had come to recognize a friend with whom our friendship would never falter or grow less. End of Chapter 10, Part 1.